Good evening. On this week's programme, the 18th century Irish convicts in Australia who were reunited with their families and making sense of the present financial crisis by looking back at the past, the history of money.
Bread, cash, dosh, dough, loot, lucre, moolah, readies, the wherewithal. Call it what you like. Money matters.
An extract from our February book club choice, The Ascent of Money by Neil Ferguson. And he continues.
To Christians, the love of money is the root of all evil. To generals, money is the sinews of war. To revolutionaries, the shackles of labour. But what exactly is money? Is it a mountain of silver, as the Spanish conquistadores thought? Or will mere clay tablets and printed paper suffice? How did we come to live in a world where most money is invisible, little more than numbers on a computer screen? Where did money come from? And more importantly, where did it all go?
The timing of the book and the TV series was both fortuitous and unfortunate. On the debit side, they were launched just as the worlds of banking and finance were going into meltdown, making it difficult to respond to rapidly changing circumstances. The upside was that we were afforded a literate and sophisticated map by one of the best historical writers of his generation of the long tunnel through which we'd come in order to arrive at the Great Recession. The jury, of course, is still out on whether or not we are actually in the middle of the Second Great Depression. Ferguson traces the simultaneous and symbiotic rise of capitalism and finance from the Medicis to Merrill Lynch. With chapters on banking, bonds, equities and insurance, you can finally get the answers to some of the questions you've been afraid to ask in a world where words like leverage, securitisation and collateral debt obligation have become part of the new argot. Joining me to discuss the ascent of money are Margaret E. Ward, financial journalist, Brian Lucey, lecturer in banking in Trinity College in Dublin, and Audrey Deane, social justice campaigner. Audrey, you might have expected the oldest surviving written records to have been about agriculture, the arts, war, hunting, who knows. They're actually about money.
That fascinated me. I thought, like you, it would be about the nicer side of the human psyche. No, it's about business. And then you move on very, very a little bit and you come to the Hammurabi, who I believe lived in ancient Babylon 1750 years before Christ, and they had debt forgiveness cycle of 3 years. Well, as Roosevelt says, the more you know about the past, the more prepared you are for the future. We should have taken that lesson on board, wouldn't you say?
Margaret, you heard at the top there, money has been for all the time, I mean, since time immemorial, money has been about belief, about faith, about some element of trust in the other guy, hasn't it?
It has been, but what's interesting about the book is we learn that money and raising money is really all about war. Mm-hmm. Because that seems to be why a lot of financial instruments were developed. Things like the bond market. Mm-hmm. You know, he traces it back and he finds that a lot of this had to do with that the amount of money that a city-state had in Italy and elsewhere wasn't enough. So they had to issue things like bonds. So money, yes, was about trust. And these bonds, you know, it was the bond to loan money and to pay it back. But in Italy, they were forced into this. It wasn't a voluntary thing. So I have to say it's a fascinating romp through financial history.
Is it a bit of a cross, Brian, between Bronowski's The Ascent of Man, Kenneth Clark's Civilization and a detective novel?
It is, and it's also, I suppose, for lovers of historical fiction, it's a bit like Ellis Peters meets all of those with perhaps a dash of Robert Harris. I mean, going back to ancient Rome, that which is valuable is money, and in Rome and in ancient times it was metals, precious metals or grain. And Marcus Crassus said that no man should call himself rich unless he could actually support an army for a year out of his own pocket. We now see, of course, that as time went on, that which became rare ultimately moved away from precious metals and rare objects through to the full faith and credit of the government. And that's where we get what's called fiat money. I mean, while this won't quite answer the question of I don't know what a tracker mortgage is, it certainly gives people who are not 100% au fait with some of the jargon that people like me blithely throw around, and Margaret, of course.
Banned.
It'll give them a great outline. And history is a fantastic guide, and if we don't understand history, we're condemned to repeat its mistakes. Unfortunately, it seems like we're condemned to repeat its mistakes anyway, even when we do understand it.
Well, he makes the point in relation to economic history in particular that we are fated to repeat the mistakes if we don't understand them. Margaret, he sees financial innovation as being just as important an element in human progress as technological innovation, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, and I don't want to insult Brian here, but you think that academics will write in a very kind of stiff manner, and that they will forget that we all learn through storytelling. But yet, this is such a densely researched book.
Yeah.
If you miss a sentence, you've missed some important jigsaw link. But his gift for storytelling is fantastic, and he makes you almost want to be an economic historian or academic.
Yeah. He made his bones really by writing about the high finance of the Prussian Empire, and it really does show, because that's where he's at his strongest, I think, when he's talking about this interrelationship between war, innovation, technological progress, and social progress. I mean, one of the things that people forget, for example, and it's brought out quite clearly here, is that people who could be very, very nasty in war, the Scottish Covenanters or Bismarck, were also often at the forefront through the fact that they had either created or were in the time of great financial innovations, the ability to also extend out the boundaries of the state and society socially.
But he also has a kind of ripping yarn aspect to it all. He makes it all, you kind of want to read about it. It's a bit like a soap opera. You can just imagine the Rothschilds sitting there. I mean, obviously they hadn't got mobile phones, or they weren't tweeting each other about the Waterloo and the outcome. In fact, I believe the first Rothschild, he found out 48 hours ahead Nathan, thank you, ahead of the people who really should have known. But you kind of really want to get on top of that. And
okay, let's go through some of those narratives, some of the chunks, some of the information that he gets across. Brian, we'll start, Margaret's already mentioned Italy. Let's start with the Medicis. In Monty Python terms, what have the Medicis ever done for us?
The Medicis, well, it really is interesting when you look at the Medicis were ultimately pawnbrokers. That's where they came from. And if you look now at pawnbrokers around Dublin or anywhere else, you'll see they usually have three balls in a pyramid. And that ultimately derives, as their mark, that ultimately derives from the seal of the Medicis. So even culturally, there's that resonance through it. The Medicis were able to harness the resources, the scarce resources of the faith and the ability of people to believe that they, as Medicis and others then, Sforzas and what have yous, would actually be able to repay their debts, either through the ability to tax or the ability through plunder. So the Medicis really, along
one way
with
or
the
other,
Lombards,
you get your money back.
A little bit like the early versions of Brian Lenihan saying that Ireland will pay back its debts at all cases. The Medicis were able to do that, and people believed them. And it was only when the Medicis found themselves in trouble with the ability to repay their debts that their own internal struggles became problematic, and we ended up with Savonarola and a lot of change in Florence. But the Medicis ultimately came back and became rich enough to basically buy the papacy.
And how did they get around the Christian strictures against usury that had seen members of the Jewish faith, for example, dominate the lending market?
Interestingly, it was actually the Lombards who first began, and the Lombards were Christian, first began to dominate the market. The Jews had a problem with usury for other Jews, but they were allowed perfectly okay by their rabbis to lend to non-Jews at an interest rate. When a good idea is a good idea, people find ways around it, even if it runs counter to their religious precepts. Anybody who studied Islamic finance will know that there are very innovative, very exciting ways in Islam whereby effectively interest, which is ultimately a payment for deferred use of your money, is provided. Islam has a very strict code against usury, and yet Islamic banks are able to operate just as competitively or not as Western banks.
So the Irish type solution to an Irish type problem.
Yeah, the Medicis got around it by basically ignoring it. And if you're rich enough, you can do what you like. If you're rich enough to buy the papacy, you can certainly do what you like.
Still on back. Sorry, Margaret, you're going to come in.
Yes, and just I think it's kind of like Italy bearing the bond child, or because of all of this, the Italians, and they were vying between the city-states in the 14th and 15th centuries, and this concept of the Florentine prestanze and the Venetian prestizi. It's where wealthier citizens were forced to loan money to their own city government in exchange for interest payments. So can you imagine if we went to the denizens of Dublin 4 and said, oh, look, sorry, you have to loan the Irish government money. Now, we'll give you interest on it, but you have to loan it. And then there was a secondary market that allowed the bondholders to sell to others in exchange for cash. Now, the Venetians actually came up with this idea in the 12th century. So that innovation, is really captured in these little Italian city-states, and fascinating stuff.
He quotes Bill Clinton's advisor, James Carville, who said, when I die, I'd like to come back as the bond markets. Then I could scare everyone. And, I mean, bonds, he's talking about them mostly in the context of sovereign debt. And there was a time when you could actually take that literally. It was sovereign debt.
About
it was
gold.
the king who actually did the borrowing, wasn't it?
And let's face it, didn't Nathan hang on to all of his... after the very, very swift defeat and Waterloo. In fact, the Prussian
you're going to
army...
have to explain. What are we talking about here?
we're talking about
the Rothschilds and the Battle of Waterloo.
I guess he had such a fantastic network that the UK guys said, look, we trust this guy even though he's a Jew, and we'll let him go to Europe and find loads of gold, a shed load of gold
during the Napoleonic
Wars to make
1812,
sure that the guys on the front would have enough materiel and money and guns and whatever you do in war. So he went around, grabbed as much gold as he could get his hands on, ended up with an absolute shed load of it. The Prussian army were late on the day in Waterloo. I mean, quel horreur, they were actually late. So it was a swift battle and all over, and the Brits were thumbs up. So really he was sitting on a disaster, meaning he had lots of gold, they didn't need it, he really needed to liquefy again. But he decided, right, I'll do a punt on the UK bonds. I think it was the Console bond, I can't quite remember. He hung on to it, the bonds went up because everybody loved Britain because they'd just won a war, and about a year later he cashed it in for some immense amount of money. And I believe it led
He got
to
a
Heinrich...
45% increase in his wealth.
In a year.
In a year.
Not bad.
Fantastic.
And his profits were worth around 600 million euro today.
And
Sterling, sorry.
Heinrich Heine put him in the kind of the unholy trio of Richelieu, Robespierre and Rothschild, saying that these three were the terrorist names that would annihilate the Ancien Regime, the old order
I
in
suspect
Europe.
it's just alliterations because their names all begin
Well, it's
with
just
R.
the
There's
fact,
no other
like
connection
he
between them.
he was held in such absolute respect and horror by whoever, depending on your ideology.
How Margaret, come in on this one if you would, because it's your country. How did the Rothschilds have a major say in deciding, this is what Ferguson said, in deciding the results of the American Civil War by doing precisely nothing?
Yes, this is fascinating. Now, the Rothschilds family, initially they assumed that they would be sympathetic to the Confederate side, okay? But that turned out not to be the case, because the Rothschilds, who were really the bankers globally that you would go to if you needed to fund wars, actually thought that because Jefferson Davis, who was the Confederate president, had said when he was a U.S. state senator that it would be fine to renege on his state's debt, they thought this was not a good credit risk. So in fact, they were kind of holding off, but the South, so they weren't buying the bonds that the South was issuing in order to raise money for war.
To raise the money for
So
war,
what the Southerners did instead is they issued cotton bonds. Now at that time, the trade from the U.S. American South was 80% going into the UK.
Into Liverpool.
Into Liverpool. The industrial machine in the UK was very, very dependent on the southern states. So they wisely issued these cotton bonds. Now the cotton bonds were backed by physical delivery of cotton. But what happened is that the Union soldiers came and they cut off New Orleans.
And they held the port.
And they held the port,
The blockade.
which meant
Yeah.
that if you wanted to redeem your bond in exchange for cotton at that price, you couldn't.
You had to go in and out, which was much too dangerous.
And there's a fascinating series of vignettes throughout this, not just of that, but also in 1914, 1915. And he alludes to it, but doesn't really talk about it in the Second World War, but how the bond markets react very rapidly to information, and how the bond markets reacted to the information about blockades and blockade runners. And then in the 1870s and 1880s, the way bond markets were globalised and were able, through the telegraph, to effectively be almost as integrated as they are now. Maybe not at nano speed in Twitter and over the internet, but within a day, something that would happen in Australia that would affect Australian government revenue would be reflected in the prices of Australian government and state debt traded in London.
Okay, I want to move on to stocks in a moment, but before moving on to stocks, let's stay with the chapter on bonds, because he's got a chapter on bonds, a chapter on stocks, chapter on property, so on and so forth.
Insurance.
And talk about the interesting case of Argentina. 1913, one of the 10 richest nations on the planet. What went wrong between 1913, Brian, and 2001, the biggest default, $81 billion in history?
Biggest default to date.
To date. Yes.
Are you hinting at something there, Brian?
Cautionary interjection there.
Well, I think it was actually not even between 1913 and 1982.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot. There were other defaults.
It was 1982 really was the first problem. Basically, what happened was you had a government which was run by the elite, for the elite and the insiders, which debauched the Argentinian currency, which ran the country as an economic set of fiefdoms for insiders, which took on a vast and unnecessary foreign debt which the Argentinian people were unable to repay, which caused the Argentinians to sequentially default from 1982 several times in the
6
1980s.
currencies or something.
Yeah,
didn't
they were running
Yeah.
vast hyperinflation because they didn't have a strong currency, and it was the defaults that caused the Argentinian economy, the defaults and the inflation, the economic mismanagement that caused the economic mismanagement caused the need for default, and the defaults then further fed in through weak government to further economic debauchery.
So
it's
you
a
had
very cautionary tale.
The middle class is wiped
Wiped
out,
out.
essentially. Their savings
Several
wiped out.
times.
Yeah,
But you're
several
left with the
times.
question, why would any sovereign debtor
Yeah.
ever honour its commitments to a foreign bondholder?
This is a fascinating
To
study.
quote the man himself, so successful, because what happened
Yeah.
was Argentina sat down, negotiated drastic haircuts for bondholders of about
35
65.
cents.
Yeah, 65. They got 35
Sorry.
cent in the dollar, or cents in the dollar, so 65%. So successful did Argentina's default prove. Economic growth has still surged while spreads are back in the 3 to 5% region, that many economists were left to ponder why any sovereign debtor ever honours its commitments to foreign bondholders. Now, I don't want to get into current events.
Go on.
But
We're talking about Argentina
Yeah.
in the 80s.
Yeah.
Or Iceland, or another.
no.
But
Margaret.
what's
Ireland is
interesting
different.
about that
Oh,
is
yes.
that earlier, before this, so this was all 2001, which was very dramatic in the history of Argentina because they had just gone through 2 IMF bailouts within a couple of months. But if you look back, right, so burning the bondholders, but if you go back a couple of generations, burning the bondholders meant you'd have gunships.
Yeah.
Coming to, say,
Literally.
no, you're going. You
And
would
yet in the
literally have
16th
gunships.
century and in the 17th century, I mean, I think it was Philip IV of Spain was known as the debtor from hell, or the borrower from hell, because he kept on defaulting.
Yeah.
And yet, here's the thing. Markets are smart in the aggregate. They price that in. If they say that Argentina or Philip IV or small island nations in the North Atlantic on soggy, wet rocks are likely to default, they'll price it in appropriately. And then they'll lend, because the markets look forward. They look back only insofar, and this is very well brought out in the chapter on insurance and on risk. The past informs the likely future path, but it doesn't determine it.
interestingly, the spread, I mean, we talk about the spread, the difference between what Germany has to pay and what we have to pay, and we went gaga when that became about 5, 6%, 7% when we had to pay 9%. The bond spread was 7,000 basis points between Argentina and the USA. That's 70%. And after the default and after the haircut was negotiated, it was back down to 300 to 500 basis points, or 3 to 5%. Margaret, equities, stock market. The equities market, the stock market was being written off. It was dead in the late 1970s. Why was that?
That's right. I'm just trying to recall. What was it, Brian, that they said? In the late 70s, they said it was dead because it went down to such a low level, 772
the Dow was
or something.
777.
And I think a few months before that, 4 months before that, there were a couple of people who said, well, look, it's going to be dead as a dodo. But then what happened is it had one of the hugest spikes ever. It brought up to, do you have the level there? I think it was over 2,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
In a very, very short space of time.
And interestingly, I checked it yesterday, the Dow Jones is 12,092, it was yesterday.
It's the power of compound interest. I mean, I remember about 15 years ago looking at a chapter in a textbook that said, will the Dow ever reach 10,000? How to teach compound interest. And, you know...
September
compound interest is
1999, 10,395. So,
Yeah.
it obviously did, and it's gone. It has exceeded that. He's interesting on bubbles.
He is. He's
You'd have
interesting at
expected him
bubbles.
to focus on the famous South Sea bubble because
Yeah.
it concerned the UK. Instead, Bryony examines what a fellow Scotsman called John Law did to France. What happened there?
Well, many people would think that he ultimately caused the French Revolution because he bankrupted he bankrupted the French government. He basically privatised the national debt. So again, we had a situation, the obverse of where we have here. At the moment, we seem to have the publicisation of private debts. In the case of France, he had the privatisation of the national debt. But of course, ultimately, that was done by converting the French government's obligations into assignats and into various forms of tradable bonds, which people were then able to trade and swap around for various levels. And it became very clear people didn't believe that the various louis of the 18th century were able to actually repay. That was combined with the fact that there was also another separate bubble going on in Mississippi, where, just like the South Seas bubble, there were stock companies and companies were issuing bonds for stuff that was never going to happen, you know, for chimerical developments in the middle of nowhere, you know, for soggy fields not in the middle of Leitrim but in the middle of Louisiana. And when that bubble burst and people realised that they were never going to get their money back, it took down the French government's ability to raise further monies on the international bond markets. That, ultimately, about 15 years later, one could argue was one of the founding reasons why the French government had to finally recall a parliament, which it hadn't done for 120 years. And that didn't work out too well from the royal perspective.
And there's an appearance in this story of a few people who smelled a rat before the
One
whole
of them
thing
was
went
an
bad.
Irishman.
It was an Irishman.
Yes,
He
Mr.
was
Cantillon.
the Irish banker and economist Richard Cantillon was so sure that Law's system would implode that he sold up and left Paris in early 1719.
And now he has the honour of having a column called after him in
There
the
we
Irish
go.
Times.
And a summer school,
Of
which I'm on the board and which will be happening in September again this year.
Plug. Okay, Audrey, from law to lay. Remind us about Kenneth Lay and the rise and fall of Enron, because he features that very prominently
Well,
in
we
the book
start
as
at
well.
the end. The happy ending is that I
The
believe...
perp walk.
The perp walk, and I know I have a bit of a fetish about it, and I don't think I'm the only Irish person who would like to see some people walking down the forecourts with chains on, rattling, because we don't do that, do we? We don't do perp walks. An awful pity, because Enron really tore the arse out of a lot of small people's pensions. And I believe our esteemed author talks about in space they can't hear you scream, and that stayed with me. I mean, that really stayed with me. The corrosive impact on ordinary people of just losing everything and being consigned to outer space and oblivion. And he talks about Enron and what they did, and we haven't got time to go into it, but basically, was it 24 years and 6 months and 26 million? That was the sentence he got, and 26 million he needed to repay, because basically they were speculating on stuff they were borrowing to speculate. In the pathways of the air or something.
And they were
like
actually, what was even worse was not so much that, because if that had been the case, one thing running through this is that Ferguson is a great believer in capitalism and in the monetary system. But he's also a believer, I think, that while you should have a degree of unfetteredness, transparency and a certain sense of government regulation, perhaps, you know, not very many regulations, but pretty ruthlessly enforced. Enron's problem was that it was all off balance sheet. Nobody could see what was going on.
Exactly.
They themselves didn't even know what was going on.
That's a familiar term, isn't
Yes.
it? Off balance sheet.
But
Yes,
what
it
about
is.
Scholes and Merton, the guys, the quants with the big brains,
Yeah.
who even got a Nobel Economics Prize in '97, who worked out how to price an option? But let's make
Actually,
sure
they didn't.
nobody else
They didn't.
understands
One
how
of the-
to
they
do
didn't-
it.
They didn't work out how to price an option. This is a really interesting thing. They did exactly not that. This is one of the things that isn't there, and it shows that Ferguson is a fantastic historian. This is a book that I think people should read. But there's an awful lot of back history. One of the more interesting guys in the financial discussions, and indeed philosophy at the moment, is Nicholas Taleb, the man who wrote The Black Swan. And Taleb points out that, in fact, option pricing was something that options were being traded for centuries. And if you look at the options that were traded in the early 20th century, in New York, they were priced just as well or badly as options 80 years later, without any fancy mathematics.
But
And what Scholes and long-term capital management did was they underestimated risk. They underestimated the fact that once in a million events happen much more often, because we haven't seen a very long history of trading in these issues.
They said once in 4.5 million years had
And then it
the
happened the
risk
following
that
day.
they'd go, and
Yeah.
it happened basically the following day.
We were told that, for example, the chances of falls in house prices, etc. I
Yeah.
mean,
they had a
there's
black
some-
box. Well, I don't really have that much confidence in black boxes, and I
Okay.
think it's
You're talking about property prices. Let's go there because just to finish off, there's an interesting footnote, by the way, would like to point out on page 234, where he says Ireland leads the field with 83% of people owning their own homes.
Yes.
Interesting, the US, Australia and the UK are next. They're around about 68, 69%. So you'd wonder, what are we like? He describes the decline of the property-owning aristocracy in the 19th century. Anybody interested in that particular topic? No.
Okay,
All right.
okay, well,
We're all afraid to talk about property after what's happened
there's
here.
a very interesting set of linkages. He has a very interesting chapter on risk and in insurance. And of course, one of the founding companies in modern fund management and insurance is Scottish Widows. And we're all familiar with the Scottish Widows ad. And the first Scottish widow on that ad was Amanda Lamb, who then went on, of course, to greater things in presenting
Roger Moore's
property.
daughter is in the ad. You know, the one
Yeah.
with the nice luxurious hair.
Yes.
So I thought you need to know that.
And Lamb went on to present this property program. There's an obsession with property around the world, but it really reaches its heights in the Anglo-Saxon countries. What I find interesting about this piece in relation to property is he doesn't really talk about the Irish market because, of course, he's talking to a US and UK. But you can be absolutely sure if he comes back to revisit this in 10 years' time or 5 years' time, there will be a significant addendum on the fact that, as we said earlier on, these extreme events happen much more often. And as we go on in time, as we see more and more events and more outcomes in finance, we get a better handle for it.
And
We should know where we stand better next time, but maybe we won't.
And being such a skilled writer, he can actually talk about the subprime market in the language that
Yeah.
ordinary people get, like ninja. Now, I have an 8-year-old, so I thought a ninja was something else that came in a plastic box out
It
of
is.
Smith's.
Explain.
Oh, no. Well, the ninja in this book means
No income.
no income, no
No
job,
job.
no assets.
No
So
assets.
that's what a ninja is, Max, if you're listening. I'm sure you are.
Also known as an Irish taxpayer.
But he just it makes that so accessible to those of us who don't spend our times reading, economic columns. He talks about that that bad debt was sliced and diced so often that even these very prudent, investors in some Norwegian cantons were investing in people they didn't know anything about in really bad debt situations.
But the ratings agencies as well were the ones who have been implicated in
but he
that,
talks
that they
about-
didn't know
It
about
goes
the
back to
value.
transparency and information and lack
And
of it.
link and relationships.
Yeah.
And let's remember, we are all subjective human beings. And that's where Merton and Scholes went really wrong, because they thought they
Okay.
had a formula and it didn't work.
To sum up, well written, comprehensive, something less than that. Would you recommend that people read it? All of you? Yes, no?
Yes, a little bit bitty. It shows the fact that it's a book tied into a TV series, but it's a fantastic starting point if people want to get a really good overview.
I think it's a superb book, and I think it takes a long time to read, and you need to dip in and out of it because you need a lot of headspace for it. But it is also a great resource that everybody should have on their bookshelf, I think.
Yes, I mean, he talks about lethal weapons and debt floating up fjords and ninjas, and he does, mention the other Bond. So I guess, it's not just a boys' book.
I must say I found it absolutely fascinating. I would also recommend that when you finish that one, because it's because of the timing, it doesn't necessarily cover the whole subprime thing and the kind of detail that it might. I would recommend go and read Michael Lewis's The Big Short.
Big Short is probably
Absolutely.
the best
Absolutely.
book published
Fantastic.
in the last 5 years.
And then go and read Michael Lewis's article in Vanity Fair,
Yes,
and then go into a darkened room with a bottle of whiskey.
No, that won't come on your programme if you say that.
Right. No. Well, I mean all of us. I'm not talking about all of us.
The Big
Okay.
Short is something that is absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, the most fantastic and frightening read.
Yeah, it is. It is frightening, but it is very, very entertaining, and it is extraordinarily well written. And we
think
shouldn't be talking about it in the context of Neil Ferguson's The Ascent of Money, because that's what we came here to talk about. But Audrey Deane, Brian Lucey and Margaret E. Ward, thank you very much. The Ascent of Money by Neil Ferguson is a Penguin paperback priced at around €14.